So Domain Gojo has been out for a week now. Done some testing with him, played him around in different formations. Think I know him pretty well by now, so let's do a guide on how to actually play him correctly. Now, I think his kit is pretty simple. If you guys pulled on him, you probably already know what his kit is all about. It's basically just his domain expansion, because not only it's able to do 300% damage taken debuff, so you have the base 100%, and then this one, depending on which turn you activate it, it can be up to 200. So that's like 300% damage taken, so one of the highest in the game. But also on top of that, very importantly, you are able to stun the enemy for 2 turns. You are able to decrease their ultimate count by another one, and basically, even with all of that, you also apply this unlimited void, which basically means every now and then the enemy may still be stunned when they try and do their attack. So like there is even this RNG element if you really want to keep on resetting, where you can literally get the enemy not doing anything for 4 turns straight. So absolutely amazing, crazy character, right? And yeah, basically you just want to do his domain as much as possible. I think 3 times is a limit, but vast majority of the time 2 times is probably what you should be aiming for, and I will talk about that specifically later on. In terms of his other skills, you can do whatever you want with them. To be honest, they are kind of just a buying you time till you actually have time to you actually charge up to do your domain expansion. You have skill 2, which is an AoE and also do damage dealt decrease. Personally, this is the one I use the most often because it's an AoE attack, and also it weakens the amount of damage the enemy is going to deal, which is actually pretty important. We'll talk about the team composition later on, okay? And then you also have alternatively his skill 3, which is single target, do a bit more damage, and also able to give a self buff to himself. However, honestly speaking, you're not really expecting the main Gojo to do too much damage. Like he is mainly just there for the utility purpose from his domain expansion. So even though this is nice buff, like if you look at the numbers, like and also how much damage it's able to do, vast majority of the time I tend to find myself using skill 2 more. But either of those skills you shouldn't really need to level them up any more than level 8, to be honest. And likewise for your skill 1, this is the only one that's able to be you will be doing when the domain expansion is out. So once again, this you actually use this skill a lot of time, but it's nothing crazy, right? It's just a bit of damage and an extra 15% crit risk decrease, which is nice, but not game breaker. So I don't think there's anything specifically for you to level this up as well. So my personal recommendation in terms of skills is just keep it at level 8 for the first 3. And domain, yeah, you do want this to be maxed out at level 10. Okay. Now in terms of his recollection bit, basically there are only 2 recollection bit, which I'm gonna strongly recommend. One is gonna be this one. This is a free-to-play one. Everyone's guaranteed to get that from Formidable Battle. This is a constant 360 ultimate gauge increase, and is for you can be doing this every 4 turns, and that's basically gonna be very helpful when you actually try to charge up your domain twice. Then the other alternative is going to be this one, which basically have a passive ability of adding 200 ult whenever you do a crit. And that's kind of why I said earlier, normally you would try to find yourself doing skill 2 instead a bit more, purely because the skill 2 is an AoE and therefore you have a bit more chance of actually landing that crit, and also it's 4 hits in total, right? So you are basically able to charge up potentially a bit more, or more likely to charge up your ult when you are actually using this regression when you're actually doing your skill 2. Now, out of the 2, which one do you prefer? I typically just stick with this one purely because everyone have access to it, and also even though this one you're kind of playing with RNG, right? Depending on how many times you crit. 360 ult is actually enough to charge up your ultimate attack consistently for both times, and I'll show you the different combination of teams that you can do in order to guarantee you're able to 100% charge this up, even with this recollection bit. Obviously, when you actually play this recollection bit, you have the potential of charging up, let's say, 600 ultimate gauge, because normally you may for the very first time, you can actually charge up your ult in just 2 turns. However, the second time when you want to charge up your domain expansion, you actually have 3 turns to charge up for it. And you may actually think, okay, maybe you can then actually get lucky and get 600 ultimate gauge instead doing those 3 turns, which is obviously going to be higher than the 360. But like I said, there's already ways for you to guarantee that you're able to do 2 domain expansion using this regression. So a lot of time I just don't bother trying to play around with the RNG in case case, you don't really want to go into like 10 turns into the battle, and then one battle RNG you're not able to pull off your domain expansion, right? So that's kind of why normally I just stick with this one. But like I said, this can potentially be useful if the enemy for some reason is kind of disrupting the way you are actually able to guarantee your way to charge up using the standard method. But that's basically the recollection choices. Now, the next thing I'm going to briefly talk about before going into team comp is about his the characteristic of his domain, and also replacing domain or overwriting domain with other character who have domain expansion. Now, basically, if you actually take a look at the description for his domain expansion, what you realize is that when the domain expansion is being used, for when you actually use the automata, you are able to apply all of those things, which is for however many turns, right? All of the status effect, which is for however many turns. Same thing with the debuff. You will be applying it as soon as you use it, and then the debuff will be valid for 4 turns. So even if your domain get overwritten in the middle, you are not actually losing any of them. The only thing you're losing, I think, is just the guaranteed hit, which, to be honest, doesn't really matter too much. So all of this, honestly speaking, doesn't matter. So it doesn't really matter as long as you're able to release the domain expansion. It doesn't really matter whether the domain is still going to be there or not. And this is like a both a good thing and also a bad thing, because the good thing is, yes, the effect will still be present even if you override your domain or for whatever reason your domain ended early. However, obviously the bad thing is the same way you are not able to increase your ultimate count, that is also not triggered at the end of the domain expansion. This is triggered as soon as you use the ultimate attack. So that basically means even if you overwrite it, you still wouldn't be able to charge up your ultimate attack straight away for the next 3 turns. So basically, it's kind of a double-edged sword. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is that vast majority of the effects this ultimate attack is going to use will be valid or unleash on turn one, and it really doesn't matter whether the domain is going to be available or not. And what that basically means is that it's a fairly neutral thing whether the domain is going to be present or not, because if the domain goes away, it's not like you are going to get any benefit of that, because you have already done everything you have on turn one. And if the domain doesn't go away, you don't get any extra benefit either. So basically, there's no advantage of removing it early, and there's no disadvantage of it being removed early. So it's a very neutral thing. And that basically means if you actually want to play this alongside with another character, which also have domain expansion, what you just need to simply weigh it up is that which one is actually going to be more beneficial for you. So the classic example I'm going to give you is going to be Mahito, because Mahito does something kind of similar. When he actually uses his domain expansion, he's going to do a chunky part of his damage from his domain expansion, which is going to be fixed on enemy HP, the fixed 15% HP damage, right? And also at the same time, within his domain, he's also going to get a bunch of other extra benefit, and also all of his skills are going to get some additional effects, etc. So basically, depending on which part of this domain expansion you really want to concentrate on, you can then decide whether you actually want your Mahito's domain to be present, in which case you actually want to release Domain Gojo's domain expansion first, and then follow up by Mahito. Or if it's the other way around, you actually want Domain Gojo. Well, actually, no, it's better for you to actually finish the domain expansion from Mahito as soon as possible, because maybe you're trying to stall the team and you actually want to recycle this through as fast as possible. Because remember, for Mahito, it's actually only when the domain expansion is lifted, you get 2 turns of ultimate gauge not being able to be increased. So there's benefit of removing Mahito's domain expansion early, but obviously you're also trading off on certain aspect when you do remove it early. So depending on how the battle goes, you can potentially switch around the order just to see which one would actually suit you more. But from just Domain Gojo's point of view, his domain expansion is very neutral. It's not going to do you any good if it's on, but it's not going to be any bad if it's removed either. So basically, it's just a very neutral thing. Depending on the team lineup, depending on the enemy, you need to decide which one you actually want to replace it by. Vast majority of the time, I think Mahito is probably the only one I would say is actually beneficial to remove it early. So if it's Mahito, I'll probably say Mahito first, then follow up by Domain Gojo. But if you actually play Mahito as a DPS and you actually want to activate those additional effects when the domain is available, then obviously you swap it around. For all other characters like Hanami, Jogo, etc., Domain Megami is almost always better for their domain expansion to be available. And in those cases, I will almost certainly recommend you play Domain Gojo's Ultimate Attack first and followed by their Ultimate Attack to override Domain Gojo's one, because like I said, it's a very neutral effect that what this one is able to provide. Okay, now let's talk about team building with Domain Gojo. When you're building a team around Domain Gojo, I think the number one question you're going to ask yourself is going to be how many times do you want to release your domain expansion in this battle? And the answer is basically going to be 1 time, 2 times, or 3 times. 3 times is the absolute limit, because when you use domain expansion, that's basically going to make sure you are not able to charge up your ult for another 2 turns afterwards. So it's just physically not possible to do it 4 times. Okay, so 3 times is the absolute limit. And even for 3 times, a lot of time it's pushing it. I would say it's not very realistic, but it's doable. And if you do actually want to see a gameplay or footage where this has happened, then please do check out another content creator called Kujura. He posted a video back in the days, I think for the JP version, where he actually released domain expansion 3 times in the same battle, which was great. It's a good video. But he even said so himself in that video that is it requires very specific team setup and also depends on the stage. So it's not something that you really can guarantee every single time. And if you take a look at the team composition he used, for example, in order to make sure Domain Gojo had to charge up his ult fast enough, he had to use characters such as Blue Yuji and also Ijichi in order to charge up ult. And a lot of time, you are probably better off actually replacing them with stronger characters, right? So that's kind of why, whilst it's doable and it's a very cool thing to see it happen, right? 3 domain expansion in one battle, that's absolutely amazing. But a lot of time it's just not realistic, and also even when it's achievable, you may actually be better off just doing it twice, because you also have to remember the strength of that domain or the debuff ability from that domain scale based on how many times it's remaining when that domain expansion is released. And if I can release 2 domain expansion early, that's probably going to be better than releasing 1 domain expansion early but then 2 domain expansion late, etc. So that's kind of why a lot of time I will probably suggest you guys try to go for just 1 domain expansion or 2 domain expansion. Now, if you're just going for 1 domain expansion, to be honest, you are probably just playing Domain Gojo in the same way you will be playing Domain Megami, because Domain Megami can actually give 340% damage taken debuff actually, which is actually higher than what your Domain Gojo is doing. And if you're only going for 1 domain expansion, normally that means you are able to burst the enemy down when you actually do that debuff, so you don't really care about the stun ability either or any other utility this domain expansion can provide. So I'm not going to talk too much about any team composition where you are only aiming to do his domain expansion once, because that's just your standard burst strategy, and there are just so many different ways of doing it, right? You literally just play 3 different supporter plus 1 DPS. There's nothing hard about that, so I'm not going to talk about that. And instead, what I'm going to focus on is ways that you can reliably guarantee you are always able to release domain expansion twice in the battle. Now, I'll try lots of different things with different recollection and character, etc. There are only 2 lineup which I found to be guaranteed for me to do this every single time, or at least like low-ish requirement for me to guarantee it. Now, when I say this is the absolute when I say this can guarantee, I really mean that, because when I was testing it, basically I'll remove all of the other external factor, in the sense that my Domain Gojo wouldn't hit at all. My Domain Gojo didn't actually kill any enemy or break any enemy, because obviously when Domain Gojo actually does those things, he's actually going to get a small boost to his ultimate gauge. And also obviously for the recollection, I decided to use this one, which is a guaranteed fixed number rather than the RNG dependent like-minded sister, etc. So that's kind of why the 2 strategy or the 2 lineup I'm going to tell you guys is absolutely able to guarantee you're able to pull off 2 domain expansion every single time. However, depending on the stages, for example, if you can actually time your attacks so that you have to kill off one enemy or break the enemy, etc., or maybe you want to play around with like-minded sister, which can potentially give you a bit higher RNG-ish recollection, then you may be able to make some small adjustment to the team. Maybe you don't need to play Toge, maybe you don't need to play Unity or some other recollections there, and that can still allow you to do 2 domain expansion. But the ways I'm going to tell you today in this video is basically what's able to absolutely guarantee it, no matter what the stages or what kind of enemies you're facing. Okay, now the two are actually very similar. They all require this golden trio or golden triangle of Toge, Domain Gojo, and also Yaga. And the recollection on Domain Gojo, like I said, I kept this consistent one, so it's always going to be this one. Okay, and to be honest, that is the best recollection for Domain Gojo as well. Now, the only other thing which actually differ between the two is that in one scenario, what you can do is you can actually make your Toge just be on the field for just one turn. So that's kind of why I put this taunt recollection. And then basically what that means is for the remainder of the battle, you can have a backup option into your team. And then your fourth slot is just going to be whatever DPS you want. And this way you have one consistent way where you have three supporter or buffer or slash debuffer in the sense of Domain Gojo, Gakuganji, and also Yoga. I'll talk about why Gakuganji later on at the end of the video. But basically this then turns into a standard burst strategy. However, it's obviously not a straightforward burst because you can actually do domain expansion twice, and therefore you can burst twice as well. So that's kind of why this is one way of doing it. However, if this is the way you're doing it, you absolutely need to have Unity on it. I have tried replacing Unity with other recollections. For example, the one you actually get from Domain Gojo's banner. For example, this one. This one can give 15% ult gauge increase for 2 turns, but that's not enough. So you absolutely need Unity for this. The only cases where you can potentially get away with not having Unity and use an alternative instead. For example, the one from his own banner. Where's again? This one, you can potentially swap this onto this, but only if you have other means to somehow top up your ult gauge tiny bit, and that probably normally requires you actually breaking an enemy, or you actually manage to kill off an enemy, or maybe rather than using this one, which have a fixed ult gauge increase, you actually play around with the RNG aspect from like-minded sister. So there are other ways to make this work without Unity, but Unity is basically what's able to guarantee you to do it. Now, I'm not going to show you the actual game clip because it's a pretty boring stage. I've done it on Tower Floor 21 when there are like four enemy who are all single targets, so I can control who they attack, etc. So that's kind of why I'm not going to show you the full game clip. But one thing you basically just need to know is that you want to activate Unity on turn 1, the very first time around, so that even when Toge dies after the first turn, you're able to still charge it up. And then basically you do your first domain expansion on turn 4. And then afterwards, what you have to do is for your second domain expansion, you actually want to do a combo attack between 2 other characters. So that's basically what's going to give you an extra boost in terms of your ultimate energy, and that's how you would then be able to release your domain expansion the second time round. And it's very tight, so that's kind of why you kind of absolutely need Unity, and you won't be able to get away without swapping Unity into a different recollection unless you're able to somehow, other ways of cheesing an extra bit of old energy from either killing or breaking or like-minded sister, etc. So that's basically one way of how you can guarantee you able to do 2 domain expansion in one battle. And for this to work, Toge only need to be on the field for 1 turn, which is absolutely great because then you can actually go into your property. Then the second way of doing that, this one is actually going to require Toge to be on the field for the whole battle. So basically, Toge is there not just to help you for the very first domain expansion, but he is also going to be needed there in order to help you charge out for the second domain expansion as well. And even with all this, you still need another recollection, which is able to increase your ult energy. However, you no longer need Unity because Toge is actually now available to help you for the second time round. And that's kind of why you are then able to actually swap this for the recollection that you can get from Domain Gojo's own banner. Now, this one is obviously, like I said, once again, if you actually want to play around with the RNG from like-minded sister, or you have some other ways of cheesing there, for example, potentially actually breaking the enemy or killing off the enemy, you can potentially get away without having this recollection. But otherwise, this is going to be a hard requirement in order for you to actually do domain expansion twice. So that's basically the second lineup. But like I said, it's actually a very similar strategy because it kind of always needs these 3 characters. The only difference is that if you want Toge to die, then you have to bring Unity. Whereas that if you're okay with Toge actually being on the field, then you can get away with not playing Unity, but playing another recollection who give a slightly smaller increase into your old energy. Now, out of the 2, Obviously, this is going to be the one that I actually recommend more because it actually frees up a slot for your actual DPS. If you actually take a look at this one, you then realize that there's no DPS slot. If I actually have to put a DPS here, then I'll have to trade out one of my other supporter, which is either going to be Yaga or Gakuganji here, and that basically means your actual damage output is not going to be as high. And that's kind of obvious, right? Because you have basically here Toge taking up a whole slot where he's doing nothing in terms of your offensive capability other than just helping you to charge up ultimate energy one turn quicker. So that's kind of why vast majority of the time, if possible, you are probably going to be better off just using this strategy where you just force your target to die after turn one. But obviously, in some cases, for example, when there's like a 3-star condition where you can't have anyone retreating, etc., then you kind of then have to resort to the second method instead. Okay, now the last thing I'm going to talk about is going to be why I had Gakuganji in both of this. Now, it doesn't have to be Gakuganji specifically, but it's going to be 100% you want a character who is actually able to do some kind of like physical technique damage taken increase or curse technique damage taken increase. And I mentioned this in one of my previous video on how to maximize damage output, but basically you want to have 3 different types of debuff or buff skills available on your team. And one is going to be damage taken increase or damage taken damage taken buff or damage taken debuff, which you're going to get from your Gojo. The other one is going to be your curse technique and physical technique increase, which right now in the game, there's only very few characters who are able to do it, and Yaga is the best choice out of that. If you only care about curse technique, you can potentially swap this with Kaito, but if you actually want like physical technique, then Yaga is the only person to do it. What you can do SSR Yaga, but SSR Yaga actually gives a smaller portion of this, so vast majority of the time you will be better off just playing Yaga. And then the third type is going to be your curse technique or physical technique debuff. And that's kind of why it's very important for you to mix them up. Now, something I think a lot of people have been saying is that it's a very broken team if you have Domain Gojo and also Domain Megumi together, because they both give like a 300% increase in terms of their debuff skill. If you actually do the math, you don't realize that's not actually a very good team composition, because while you actually have 300% increase from Domain Gojo and another 300% or 340% from Domain Megumi, and then you add in the plus 100 base, that together is going to be 740 if you do the math, which is less than double of what you're able to get from your domain expansion from Gojo. Because if you just do it by just Domain Gojo without Domain Megami, what you realize is that you are doing a 300% extra and you have a base of 100. So that by itself, just Domain Gojo is already a 400% multiplier, whereas Domain Megami is, because they have the same type of debuff, you're just adding another 340% to it. So it's actually less than double of what Gojo is able to do. However, if you're actually able to bring a curse technique or damage technique debuff, because this is a multiplication, what you can then see is that 4 times, because you can stack this 4 times, 37.6, that's more than 100%. So by actually bringing a curse technique or physical technique debuffer, you are actually able to more than double of the amount of debuff you're able to do, which is actually a lot higher than what Domain Megami is able to add to your team. So that's kind of why Domain Megami plus Domain Gojo is actually nowhere near as good as Domain Gojo plus another curse technique or physical technique debuffer. And that's also another reason why, if you saw my guide on suggesting which limited character should you pull, I mentioned specifically that if you do not have Blue Ghetto on your team, then you absolutely have to get him. If you do not have Gakuganji or Green Ghetto on your team to fulfill that role of curse technique debuffer, then you absolutely have to prioritize Blue Ghetto over Sukuna, because by playing Blue Ghetto, all of a sudden you're able to more than double the amount of damage you're able to do for any curse technique team, which is a lot higher than what you're able to do with any other supporter. So that's kind of why for your last slot, in terms of your supporter, is always going to be a curse technique or physical technique debuffer. So that's kind of why I put Gakuganji here, but like I said, you can also swap this with a Green Ghetto or Blue Ghetto, etc. They kind of do all the same type or same category of debuff. And that's also kind of why for this team it's very straightforward, because you're able to bring 1 DPS on top of your 3 different type of buff or debuff. However, for this lineup, you it's going to be slightly difficult because you won't actually be able to bring all three different types. So if you do actually bring a proper DPS, then you would obviously be sacrificing your firepower in return because you have one less type of buff or debuff skill. Now there is ways around that. For example, blue Ghetto and green Ghetto can actually do decent amount of damage themselves. So if you do actually have them, then they can actually suffice as both the role of a debuffer and also damage dealer at the same time. So that could potentially work. If that's the case, then yeah, it's probably okay for you to actually bring Toge onto your team. However, if you're using like a proper DPS who do not have the ability to either like let's say self buff, and when I say self buff, I mean you have to be like a curse technique increase buff. It can't be a buff, for example, the one from let's say Blue Gojo. This kind of character, self buff is not good because it's a damage dealt increase, which is going to be the same type as what Domain Gojo is able to offer. I mean, I know you can't even play them on the same team because they're both Gojo. However, what I'm trying to say is that this type of buff is going to overlap with your Domain Gojo, so that's what you want to avoid. Instead, what you will probably be better off will be playing the likes of Nobara, whose buff is more like curse technique increase. So if you do actually have a DPS who happen to have potentially one category of buff or debuff built into themselves, then you can potentially, in this kind of situation, then swap out the corresponding. For example, if there's a character, a DPS with a built-in debuff, then you can swap out Gakuganji for that character. Or if it's a character such as Yellow Nobara, who have a built-in curse technique increase, then you are actually able to swap out Yaga. Although if you swap out Yaga, you don't have to put this recollection potentially on Gakuganji instead. So basically, you don't have to change your teams around accordingly. But yeah, so that's basically the two different team lineup that you can do with Domain Gojo to still ensure he is able to guarantee two domain expansion no matter what the stage is.